The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
The last long weekend of the season is, of course, Labor Day. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. So tonight on the Agenda in the Summer, the new president of Unifor is here on why and how her union is turning the page. Canada's largest private sector union has a new president. She is the first woman to hold that position and takes the reins after the controversial exit of the former president. With us now on what that means for the course she's plotting for Unifor, their new president, Lana Payne. In full disclosure, Unifor represents some of the employees here at TVO, including some in this studio right now. Hi, it's very nice to meet you.
You too. Great to be here.
It used to be that unions covered one sector per union. Now Unifor is a merger of many private unions. I believe you represent across 29 sectors. Can you give us an overview of what Unifor, who Unifor represents and what you do for your members?
We have about 315,000 members, mostly in the private sector, although we do have members in the healthcare sector in Ontario and Nova Scotia as well. But big sectors of the economy, energy, telecom, auto, manufacturing. If I miss any, they're going to be really upset with me. Retail, warehousing, pretty much every sector of the economy, Unifor represents members there. And obviously, we bargain collective agreements for them, about 3,000 workplaces across the union. So it's a pretty amazing organization. And pretty much 90-plus unions that were historically either on their own that have come into over many decades, and yeah.
Well, you mentioned that you have some 315,000
and media
members.
Too, of course.
And media, of course, being TVO here. But in 2021, Canada's workforce was estimated between 15 to 18 million workers. There are other unions out there, but do you see it as an opportunity for more Canadians, perhaps, to join your union?
Yes, I actually think we're in a really special moment in time right now. We had about 4 decades of real challenges. Worker power was diminishing in the economy. It was harder to organize into unions. Labor legislation had not kept pace with kind of modern society, nor did it empower workers, and neither did labor market policy. So we had a lot of those kinds of challenges, and as a result, union power was diminishing. But now what we're seeing happening is more workers are joining unions. Obviously, I think the pandemic really played a significant role. So those 4 decades of inequality growing, and then the pandemic, workers saw their value to society again and to the economy. And we're seeing a renewed kind of worker militancy as a result of that in collective bargaining tables. We probably have about 300 to 400 agreements left to do. Just opened this year for the rest of the year. And we've had more disputes this year. We had a record number of strikes in 2021. So we're seeing, more militancy by our members to push at the bargaining table to make sure that they're getting their fair share of the pie. And
you mentioned you mentioned a few things that I want to come back to in a moment. But you said militancy. I think people will hear militancy and say that doesn't sound how we should behave. What do you mean by that?
Well, it means that they're willing to take strike action if that's what's required to improve their collective agreements, and also militancy in the sense that they're joining unions again. And I think it's important to do. Otherwise, we're not going to be in a place where workers are going to be able to catch up for lost ground over many decades. Wages have not kept pace with inflation in this country. Now inflation is at record levels. Levels we haven't seen in a couple of decades, and as a result, workers' buying power, purchasing power is lessening, and I think most people would agree that we have an affordability crisis in this country right now. I know people on your show have said this numerous times. Economists have been saying it. And I just know it from our members. And that feeling is spreading and spilling over into collective bargaining tables. We have to be able to make ends meet. Our paycheck doesn't go as far as it used to. Housing prices are extreme. And as a result, and yet at the same time, we're seeing corporate profits rise. In 2022, the first quarter of 2022 was the highest share of GDP that we've seen in corporate profits since they started, collecting this data by Statistics Canada. So it's an indication of, all of those things coming together and workers saying, okay, we need to collectively build our power in order to get our share of the pie, or we're going to be permanently left behind here.
Well, you mentioned inflation, and I think some of those companies, one of the explanation that they've given in raising their prices is because it's inflation. Today we have record low unemployment, but inflation is eroding workers' paychecks. How can union membership benefit an individual who has a job but is still struggling?
Yeah, lots of things that we've been doing at the bargaining table to help newcomers, new workers, new people who are joining our union. In some cases, we're negotiating cost of living allowances so that if inflation rises, you get an extra bump in pay as a result of it. Obviously, improved working conditions coming out of the pandemic. Well, we're still feeling it in many ways. People are still getting sick from this virus. We're still, facing health and safety issues in workplaces. This comes up a lot. Continues to come up a lot, and a union can help with that. It gives you an ability, to bargain with your employer, not just over things like wages and benefits and pensions, but how do you make your workplace safer? How do you improve mental health in your workplace? Having that collective voice in your workplace really makes a difference to the change that you can bring, and workers are seeing this. There is a dissatisfaction out there now with respect to, a sense that people are not necessarily feeling that they owe something to their employers anymore. And that's partly because of how people have been treated. Lisa Laflamme, I mean, if you can do that to somebody of that stature, what's happening with regular workers out there? And more now workers are seeing unions as a path to be able to fix their place of work, but also their society, because unions just don't do good work with respect to changing and improving working conditions. We do a lot of work in our communities, and that's really, the idea behind Unifor and other unions, that we see ourselves as a social union, a modern union. It's not enough just to fix the conditions of work. We must also fix the conditions of the world. And that means, pushing governments to have better public services. It means making childcare more affordable. It means having health care and dental care and all of the things that we know are necessary, social wages, if you will, to improve people's living standards.
You mentioned Lisa Laflamme, and if anyone doesn't know, she was the anchor at CTV, and she was let go supposedly because her hair was gray and she was getting older. But you mentioned before that more people are joining unions, but data in the US anyway, illustrates that union membership has been in decline in North America since the 1980s. The share of US workers who belong to a union has fallen since 1983, when 20% of American workers were union members. In 2021, 10.3% of US workers were in a union. That's about half as many. To what do you attribute this decline?
Well, lots of it is a relationship related to what was happening in legislation. For example, making laws that make it really hard to join a union. And in many parts of the United States, they have what they call right-to-work states, which virtually, allows people to opt out of the union in their workplace. But it has been a systematic response to the union power that you would have seen in the 80s, where workers were gaining, 70s and 80s particularly. A lot of this is driven by government and, deregulating labor market policy. In our own country, what happened with employment insurance in the 1990s was a perfect example of this. It really was, the changes were about punishing workers for being unemployed instead of saying, well, really, we need to be empowering workers to make sure that they can get their piece of the pie, not have to take any crappy job that's out there, but be able to be supported until they find a job that either meets their skills or also provide training so that they can upgrade. And I think, you know, for a long time, the state and governments were not playing the role that they needed to play to give workers the kind of boost up that they needed. And now individually, but also collectively, workers are saying enough. And we are starting to see a resurgence. You know, those numbers in the US are, I believe, going to start to change. You're looking at organizing happening in Amazon and Google and Apple, all of these big corporations who've been basically controlling the economy and treating workers poorly in the case of, you know, precarious work, not good pay, you know, not really what I would call a family supporting job in many of those workplaces. And as a result, workers are finally saying, okay, we're going to try and do something about this. Even in places where organizing is extremely hard. If the Amazon example, I think, is inspiring to all of us, but we have our own examples of this in Canada. WestJet employees with Unifor, we've just signed a first collective agreement with them in Calgary and Vancouver, and a new group of WestJet employees have joined Unifor now in Toronto. So workers are looking for opportunities to be able to join unions and change the conditions of their lives.
Do you think that, you know, because you did say that the pandemic kind of shifted the relationship between employees and employers. We've heard of the Great Reset, people organizing at companies in the past that we never saw, Amazon, Starbucks. Do you think that this moment right now, because of what we've seen during the pandemic, is pushing that?
I do. I think the pandemic became kind of the defining moment after that 40 years of kind of, you know, workers losing ground. And then all of a sudden the pandemic crystallized, yes, we are important. Workers are important to how the economy can function, to how our society functions. You know, people were out banging pots for healthcare workers, and every single day there was a news story that said how important frontline workers were. And yet at the same time, employers were removing pandemic pay. So it's an important moment that we're in. I think unions have to, though, also recognize that we have to do the work to push forward, to be opening, to create space for all groups of workers, and not to be complacent in this moment. It's not good enough to kind of sit back and say we're happy with 14, 18% unionization in the private sector. It means we've got to do our work, and Unifor is committed to doing that.
I just want to shift gears a little bit to talk about why you're in the seat, you as president. Just before you were elected, Unifor was in the news with some disparaging headlines. Yes. I'd like to read you a few examples. This is from CTV, April 5th of this year. The headline is, Toronto Police's Financial Crimes Unit to investigate former union head Jerry Dias. Another headline says, Unifor to release full investigation into former President Jerry Dias, and that's from the Toronto Star earlier this summer on July 3rd. And finally, from July 25th, 2022, the headline reads, desperate texts by Jerry Dias tried to stop investigation into wrongdoing, and that's from the Canadian HR Reporter. I'd like to ask you a couple of questions regarding Mr. Dias, who you took over from. Where is the investigation of him at now?
Well, in terms of the police, I'll leave them to speak to that.
Is it a criminal matter?
For us, well, I understand that they're investigating, but that's all I know about what they're doing. For the union, it was about, you know, making sure we were doing everything right. You know, when we received the complaint, we went to an external investigator because I felt that was the important thing to do. The union couldn't investigate itself. I didn't think that would be appropriate. I was guided by what our Constitution would say in these matters. And, you know, I think if we're going to be the union that we established ourselves to be in 2013, which is a transparent, accountable, democratic union, a modern social union, then you have to do those things. And I don't believe you could ever, you know, not tell your membership about this crisis in our union and about what had occurred. I don't think you can build the kind of union you need if you're not being transparent with your members. Obviously, part of my campaign was about that if we want to be that union, we have to do certain things. And we're continuing to do that. We'll be establishing a task force on our code of ethics, which is a really strong code of ethics, but maybe the infrastructure around it isn't great enough. And so the task force goal will be to look at how we can make improvements around our internal policies and best practices, and do we need constitutional changes. We'll also be appointing an integrity officer for our union, which will report out to our National Executive Board and our conventions and our conferences and policies, conference policies, to be able to basically say, we've looked at this, this is our report for the year. And any number of other things that we will continue to engage with our members around these things. I don't think you can say something happened and you can just move on. I believe it's important that you review, you reflect, you improve, and you be honest with your members about what has happened, and that's what we've done.
And I imagine, too, trust is something that you have to work to repair. And trust is something that has impacted many industries, not just Unifor.
Yeah.
I know this isn't the union you represent, but it's a question about trust. Recently, the Globe and Mail broke the story that another union, UFCW, worked with Uber to ensure that the Ontario government would not classify gig workers as employees, therefore denying them certain benefits. In your view, what impact could that have on the strength and future of unions?
I think it's really important that we have these kinds of conversations in the labor movement, because it is a broader topic around the future of work. And for me, I never shy away from those things. I think it's important to have good dialogue and good debate about these things. For our union, we represent many workers who are not what you would think as a traditional employee. They're independent contractors. I come from a local union that represents fish harvesters who own fishing vessels, and we represent truck drivers and courier drivers who, are independent contractors. So there are many forms of employment. The difference is, how do we give them collective bargaining power? And I think that is something that needs to be challenged. One of the things that we've been talking about in our union, and I've just noticed in California that they've passed a bill now that talks about this, and that's sectoral bargaining, so that we can lift workers up in sectors that may have low unionization. So the retail sector, as an example, what would sectoral bargaining look like for retail workers, so that we can lift everybody up and not just a small portion of that sector? These are the kinds of conversations we need to be having right now in our labor movement. How do we lift up all workers? And that means gig workers too.
It's noted that you are the first woman to hold the position of president of Unifor. Should we be past having to mention that?
Hell yes, but we're not, apparently. Of course, I mean, I've been asked this a fair bit in the last couple of weeks. But what's interesting is, within our union and within our workplaces, the world is changing. Mm-hmm. And I hope if there's one thing that comes out of this, it's not going to be the last, obviously. And I think it's really important. Representation matters. We all know this. We know it in our union committees. We know it in our workplaces. And if we're going to be a union for everyone and with everyone, then that means there has to be space and place for women, for workers of color, for Black people, for Indigenous folks, to be at all levels of our union, including in leadership levels.
There's a new term coming out of the pandemic ways of working. It's called quiet quitting.
Yes.
A worker who shows up, does what's expected of them. And what is your sense of what is really going on in today's pandemic-steeped workforce?
Quiet quitting, this is a really interesting concept. In the union world, we would call that work to rule. But what I think is the juxtaposition of this is, quiet quitting is almost an individual action. And if you really want to change your workplace, the way to do it is through a collective action, which is, my advice is to all the quiet quitters: join a union, have real workplace power, and change your conditions of work that way, instead of suffering alone and trying to have a protest by not sending your email past 5 o'clock. I think that there are other ways that you can change these things permanently, and that's through unionization.
Do you think that, because this is something I've only learned in my later years, the role of the union. I think there's a lot of kind of a trepidation is when we are in a workspace is to perform above and beyond what we're expected to do, because yes, some people might be the great resignation, or maybe some people are quiet quitting. People do worry about the future, right? They want that stability. Do you think that people know what unions can do for them?
I think that we have to do probably more work around these things. It obviously is, it's tough sometimes to explain what it is that unions do on a daily basis, but our members are sometimes our best champions when it comes to that, talking about the role of the union in the workplace and the changes that you can bring about. Even in between collective bargaining, having that ongoing dialogue with your employer through labor management meetings to say, this is kind of not working here. We need to have a better workplace. And I think if you look at the tightening labor market that we have right now, employers are going to have to get their heads around this. This is not going to change anytime soon. And the way you deal with that is you're going to have to retain employees and you're going to have to recruit them. And it's not going to be easy because there's going to be lots of competition out there for good talent, for a good workforce. And my response to them will be, maybe you need to look at your wages, maybe you need to look at your working conditions and stop thinking that the solution is that I can just treat people the way that I want and, through precarious employment or gig employment or any of these things. There is going to have to be, I think, a realization by employers in this country, but in other parts of the world too, that that's not going to work anymore. And I think that's the turning point we're in right now.
Finally, we only have a minute or so left. Your Twitter handle says, "Believer, a better world is possible." How will you achieve that through your new job?
Organize every single day with our members, and when you do that, you build worker power.
Why is this work important to you?
It's, I believe in unions. I believe in working people, and I believe in the collective. And it's what I've known for 30 years, and I think it's important that workers have a voice and are empowered to be able to have a piece of the pie, but also change the conditions of the world so it's better for them. And I believe in change.
Lana, thank you so much for making time with us. I know you have a very busy schedule, and it was fun talking sneakers before we taped.
Yes. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Opioid deaths rose dramatically across Ontario during the pandemic. And according to the Office of the Chief Coroner, that hit northern communities hardest. Charnel Anderson covers the Northwest for Ontario Hubs. She joins us now from Thunder Bay. Hello, Charnel.
Hi, Dan.
All right, so earlier this week was International Overdose Awareness Day, and you wrote about the opioid challenges in Northern Ontario specifically. How would you summarize the situation there?
So it's not good. As you said, the coroner's office recently released data on opioid deaths in the province through the second year of the pandemic. And the top 6 health units, so that's health units with the highest rates of opioid-related deaths during this period, were in northern communities. And topping that list was Thunder Bay, which had the highest rate of opioid deaths overall at 82.1 deaths per 100,000 people. And so that's more than 4 times the provincial rate for the same period. And, looking at this data overall, deaths from opioids rose dramatically during the pandemic. So the year before COVID, roughly 4 people per day died from opioids, but that doubled to 8 people per day during the second year of the pandemic. But the good news, if you want to call it that, is during the first quarter this year, opioid-related deaths dropped 10% compared to the same period last year. However, this data it contains both confirmed and probable opioid deaths. So these figures may change a little bit, but I think we're all hoping to continue to see this decline.
You mentioned the COVID-19 pandemic. What was it specifically about the pandemic that made the situation worse?
Well, so of course, a feature of the pandemic was isolation, and that led to changing habits among drug users who are encouraged not to use alone, in case they overdose. But because of COVID, services like safe injection sites weren't open as they normally would be, possibly leading people to use alone, which is really one of the tenets of harm reduction. Don't use alone because it can be really dangerous. And, there are other issues like border closures that possibly impacted the drug supply. And then there's concerns that the drugs themselves may have been more toxic. So there's really a number of things, pandemic-related effects that may have caused the rise in opioid deaths.
All right, so you spoke to the not-for-profit Elevate NWO. NWO obviously stands for Northwestern Ontario. How is their organization helping drug users and the situation?
So Elevate is a community-based nonprofit, as you said, here in Thunder Bay, and they provide services for people living with HIV and AIDS, and they also do harm reduction. So they have a peer program where people with lived experience go out and provide harm reduction. So they'll help people connect with services if that's something that they want, and just connection in general, making sure people are okay and that they have what they need. And another initiative that Holly, she is the executive director at Elevate, an initiative that she's really proud of is a housing project that Elevate runs, which can house up to 40 people at a time. And, its focus is harm reduction as well. So they understand that people are going to use there and that will never be used as a reason to kick someone out. So, of course, it's a much safer environment than using alone on the streets.
Now, we talk obviously about the work that they do, but I want to talk about the frontline workers. You spoke to Holly about sort of the toll that the pandemic and sort of the crisis has had on her workers. What did she have to say?
Yeah, so Holly told me that over the last 3 years, they lost 30 clients, people that they work with, some of whom died from an overdose, some of whom they don't necessarily know the cause of death. And, she told me that her and her team develop really strong relationships with the people that they work with. These are people they've known sometimes for years. They get to know their families and their friends and their histories. And then all of a sudden they overdose and they're gone, so there's an enormous sense of loss that's left behind when people die from opioids. And, after something like that happens, Holly will sit with her team and talk about it. And, there were people that had moved into Elevate's housing program that passed away, sadly. And, as awful as it is, there was some solace in the fact that they died while they were housed. As Holly said, they didn't die in a ditch somewhere. And so she said that's, kind of what helps drive them to do this work. As hard as it is and as much loss as they endure, they do it because they want to help people.
So, Charnel, let's talk about solutions. What are the recommendations coming out of Elevate that could really start to make a difference?
So Holly's top 3 solutions are safe supply, better resources for safe injection sites, and the main point really that she emphasized is housing. This is an issue for not only people in Thunder Bay, but the region, Kenora, Dryden, et cetera. And, it ties into issues like poverty. And that's something that, Holly's really looking towards as we enter municipal election season here in the fall, because there are solutions for these problems. We just need the support and the people who are willing to make that happen.
An important story. Thank you so much, Charnel, for joining us on the program.
Thanks.
And that is tonight's Agenda in the Summer. I am Jane Jaganathan. Thanks for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. Monday, we've got a rare treat. Nam Kiwanuka talks to Steve Paikin about his new book that profiles former Prime Minister John Turner. Hope you can join us for that. Have a terrific long weekend.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism. Ontario Hubs are made possible by the Barry and Laurie Green Family Charitable Trust and Goldie Feldman.